Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar, Build Your Emergency Savings Before There's an Emergency. My name is Kelly Blount, and I'm the Program Marketing Specialist here at GECU. We're so glad you've joined us. We have a lot of great content ahead and wanted to thank you all for tuning in from wherever you may be today. Now with that, I'd like to turn things over to Todd Moore, the Director of Education with Trinity Debt Management, to introduce himself and take us through today's topic.
Well, thank you so much, Kelly, and thank you to everyone who's joining us today. Great to be back with everyone. An important topic as we continue to face the challenges of inflation and create an emergency savings before some of these other types of emergencies pop up and create even more challenges for us financially. So thank you so much for being with us. You know, as customary, I think for some of my presentations, I always like to kind of set the context and just share with you some of the research and some of the statistics that I find that'll shape today's conversation. And I did want to focus again, since inflation is one of the factors that really is a tremendous challenge for us in terms of creating our emergency savings. Just wanted to kind of take a look at where we're at this point in time. Here in May, as we continue to face some of this inflation challenge in the economy. So wanted to look back a couple years, looking back even to 2020, inflation, you know, significantly higher than where it's at today. So we are making some progress as we move our way out of the challenges, but consumer inflation at 20.9 in March of 2020. So we're continuing to bring our inflation rates down. We're nowhere near out of the 2% range that the Fed has kind of targeted for where they'd like to see interest rates. I was listening today about interest rates, even in preparation for today's presentation. And again, things are just, we're still stuck. We're making some progress, but we're still stuck. But if you look back, even in 2022, we peaked at 9.1. We were all really feeling that pinch when inflation was up at 9.1%. And now we've dropped down, I think, somewhere around 3.5%. Again, the target rate is 2%, continuing, though, to see inflation is just kind of sticking around. As I heard today that they're kind of thinking that maybe by September, you know, things will start to improve, but continues to shape our personal savings rates and the ability to save money. So I looked at some statistics from the Federal Reserve out of St. Louis. They recently published on personal savings rates, and this is really looking at our disposable income. You'll see this reflected in some of the budgets that I present today that will really kind of shape the work we do for our emergency savings fund. But personal savings rates, this is just something that we continue to track through time. Right now, we're at 3.6. Now, if you look back to 2020, personal savings rates were up to 33.8%. So of your total income minus taxes, what we would refer to as disposable income, folks were putting away quite a lot. Now, this was going into things 401ks, into different insurance products, into emergency savings. There was, you know, a third of income being put away. Well, as we know, again, inflation is kind of eating away our funds. So we're at a 3.6 personal savings rate right now, and we see this reflected again in a decrease in other types of investments and insurance and really across the board financially, all those tools that we would use for personal finance, particularly in terms of savings and you know, our retirement and other financial tools. It's just down. So again, those are some of the things we're facing right now. Our goal today, though, is despite these types of challenges, we're going to figure out how to make this work. One last slide in terms of just context for where we're at. And this is you'll see this Bankrate Emergency Savings Report has been really, it's been well used out in the media and in a lot of other kind of blogs on personal finance. It's been cited across the board, but here what we're looking at is just savings rates. Where are we at this snapshot in time? And not a surprise, 66% of adults or consumers just saying that they wouldn't have enough money to cover living expenses. Again, inflation. 44% of adults, thinking about having $1,000 or more in their savings, would they have that if facing a challenge? The answer is really no, they would not. Folks, 35% is going to have to borrow. That could be what we see in the numbers with high credit card debt at this point, more than $1 trillion, the highest that we've seen. Folks taking out personal lines of credit to cover certain expenses. So again, the emergency savings, the Bankrate emergency savings report mirrors what we're seeing within the Fed. And really, even without statistics, what many of us are just feeling that pinch as we struggle through the economy. So we're going to figure out how to make this work before we have an emergency, creating that emergency savings fund. And I wanted to I've really been into this topic, and I'm hoping that I can share that enthusiasm with you. When we think about, emergency savings, we'll talk about a lot of tools that we can use to do this kind of work. But I wanted to share with you, we're going to walk our way through kind of what I would look at in terms of financial biases. That's our decision-making function psychologically. We're going to take a look at that. We're going to look at some budgeting details, and then we'll actually put together our emergency savings plan. That's our conclusion. That's what we'll end with today. But in order to really create a strong emergency savings fund, I'm hoping that you'll take a look and kind of get excited as much as I am about the way we think about money, because it's incredibly important in terms of being successful long-term with building our fund or just improving financially. So we're going to look at some of the tools that are used in economics for decision making, things that have to do with the psychological bias, how we think about funds, what kind of barriers get in the way that keep us from really having an emergency savings fund despite inflation, just things that get in our way, our own psychological functions that get in the way as we do this work. So first things first, we'll look at this question of behavioral economics and how this impacts our budgeting and other personal finance decisions. So I've shared this with you before, but I want to reiterate some of these main points. When we think about this is looking at the psychological, the emotional, cognitive, cultural, social factors that influence our decisions. So we don't operate in a vacuum. We're surrounded by information. We're surrounded by our peers, our work colleagues, and so on. These are all things that influence our decisions. But there's also a lot of science that goes in behind, how we make certain choices. And I think it's important for you to maybe think about how you make choices and be aware of maybe your own reasoning so that you can remove that to the best of our ability, remove those kind of biases from our own thinking so that we can improve financially. And I'm going to show you a list of some common errors in our decision making that really keep us from being able to either budget soundly or to really create that emergency savings fund that we all want to create this year. So we're going to look at some of these decision making tools, and again, as we're working our way through this list, just ask yourself, are you doing these things? Are you kind of stuck within one of these kind of decision making errors? And the truth is, we all struggle with something in our decision making. So it's not as if you read this and we're without error. The key here is that you're more aware of your own thinking and your reasoning, so that we can correct some of those kind of forecasting errors in our own thinking and improve. So let's take a look at some of these approaches. Okay, delayed reward discounting. Okay, so this one focuses on this notion of overspending. Okay, preference for smaller, more immediate rewards as opposed to larger delayed rewards. Now, this has a lot to do with our impulses. And this is really tough, whether we're out with our family or we're thinking of something that we really want to purchase. The ability to pause and consider the risks, that's tough in a lot of cases, but what this does is it really creates the inability to kind of slow things down and to delay that larger reward. You want to purchase an item, you want something, the inability to delay, it really causes us to overspend. So when we set this idea up in our heads, like, hey, we want to create this emergency savings fund, and we find ourselves without that impulse control that's really needed to do the work, then we're just spinning our wheels. We're really not making a whole lot of progress. So, impulse control, walking away, waiting 24 hours, really just kind of pausing for a moment. That is an incredibly important tool, particularly as we try to work and create savings. So delayed reward discounting, maybe think about that one. And if this is something that you can use to shift behavior, incredibly important tool to use. The next one that we can often fall into in terms of just our own decision-making errors is what we call the scarcity principle. So this is basically where the less available something is, the more desired it becomes. And you see on the slide that folks are shopping there, and there's a lot of sales, and we're perceiving that we got to get this now, because if once it's gone, it's gone. And that's where we find ourselves kind of misunderstanding this relationship between supply and demand. We think that something is just going to be gone, and all of a sudden we need to purchase that item now. So places a lot of pressure on our spending decisions. We feel the pressure to buy that item or to buy multiple items with this perceived notion that we're actually going to save money through the process. And most of us know we wind up overspending or purchasing a lot of items that maybe we don't even really need, or things that are out of season that we're not going to use, or just this comes in lots of different forms. Doesn't necessarily come just in shopping for clothing. It can come in all sorts of things, collectibles, you name it. We're all guilty of that thing in our head sometimes that just tells us, this is going to be gone. It's going to be gone forever. We got to have it. But the scarcity principle, this is a common error in our thinking. And again, the science behind this is that we overspend, and it becomes a barrier again to us really reaching any of our overall savings goals or our emergency savings goals, because the funds have already been spent. So be aware of the scarcity principle. Sunk cost fallacy. So this is any past expense that's been incurred, it cannot be recovered. So what does this exactly mean? We run into this a lot of times. The idea is we've put a lot of time, money, effort into something, and at some point, what we have to understand is perhaps we have to abandon the effort. Okay, we've sunk time into something. We've put, again, money, time, effort. Something's gone into something that we're trying to accomplish, and there's not been a strong outcome. But we continue at that point to just continue to make spending decisions. We're overspending on whatever that thing is. Now, this could be a home renovation. This could be you fixing up, a car that you thought was really, that you don't want to go out and purchase another car. So you just keep putting money into the car. All those additional costs at some point become a sunk cost. We can never fully recover the value of the car, but we just keep investing in it, trying to keep it running. When in fact, maybe it would be better if we just abandoned the effort and took a different route, make a different financial decision. So we see this a lot with, it comes in a lot of, I've seen this a lot of times with first-time home buyers. They've gotten a loan, they want to fix something up, they get themselves in trouble and get overextended on their overall spending. Lots of variation on this theme. The idea is that you're aware of it, that you can shift behavior. So when you're spending time, money, and effort on something, you're not reaching the strong outcomes that maybe you perceive to be there. It's time for you to think about maybe abandoning that effort, stop wasting funds on that particular effort and move forward. Again, the money that you can recover from abandoning the sunk cost fallacy is the funds that you're going to use to build or rebuild your emergency savings fund. Tunneling, another one when we think about our decision making. Here, the idea is that if it's an emergency, people can only think about the emergency. Okay, we see things in that vacuum, in that tunnel. You know, if you're under a lot of stress, we're in a crisis, you're up against a deadline, all of our attention kind of gets focused on this one thing, and then other things get neglected. We're excluding all those other outside factors. So again, they associate this with scarcity. You know, that it's something that, you know, we can't get back. So we focus on that. Tunneling, you know, to kind of break this into a, you know, just a concrete example, you know, we're faced with a financial crisis. And again, we may forego, let's say, for instance, that let's just take it for where we're at right now with those examples that I pointed out about inflation. You know, for many of us, it has created a budgetary crisis. That is, we have less money, we're focused on the spending, whereas, you know, we can continue to make consistent investments in our 401k, et cetera. And you'll see where I'm going with this later, but tunneling is important because it can divert our attention when we need to kind of stay the course on some of our other financial choices. So when faced with the crisis, we tend up over focusing on one area and underperforming in other areas. So just be aware of that. And the last one that I'll share with you is what we call mental accounting. And this is refers to the way we classify funds based on subjective criteria. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, let's say we've got this goal to buy a car. We want to, you know, we're thinking about a car. And we start this idea of saving, you know, we want to create a fund to save for a car. And in our mind, the subjective criteria is that we're entirely focused on maybe the way we look at our funds right now, we want to save for a car, but we've got a ton of outstanding credit card debt. We're making monthly minimum payments. You know, we're not really prioritizing how we approach the big picture. So we're focused on, we've already placed a value judgment on the car, but we're not really seeing things in totality. So it's psychologically, we're kind of fooling ourselves. You know, the car fund really will never be built appropriately because we've got all of our other funds going into debts and credit cards. So mental accounting challenges us to kind of step back and see the big picture and to kind of better prioritize our overall spending patterns and really how we look at our personal finances. So again, that's a quick overview of some of the tools that you can use, just being aware of psychologically how we approach the topic. Again, those are barriers mentally in our decision making, psychologically in our decision making, that keep us from really ever reaching our financial goals or our emergency savings goals. We've got to clear those out of the way, or at least be aware of them. So the next step that I want us to talk about is really focusing on a budget. So you're aware of some of those psychological models and things that we can kind of wrap our minds around, kind of remove those barriers psychologically. Now let's focus on really thinking about how we create a budget so that we can put a budget in place, again, with the goal of building that fund. So, you know, we've talked about budgeting in the past, but I just want to run through for folks who may be new on the call with us today. You know, we're evaluating our income, our monthly expenses. We're looking at the bottom line, so we know if we're actually running, do we have any discretionary income, anything left? And then we're also going to be tracking our spending, capturing funds that may not be within the hard numbers that we have, you know, in our budget itself. So let's take a look at how this works. So when we're thinking about setting this financial goal, you know, here we're on the call today thinking about emergency savings. Want to think about what that really looks like, you know. But the closer we can build our budget around some measurable financial goal, and the more engaged you are, the better. Okay, that's really what's going to make this work. So if you've got a goal to have an emergency savings fund of X, whatever that dollar amount is, we really need to specify that dollar amount and a target date. You know, you need to put things into practice. So we don't want this just to be something that's arbitrary. We really want to figure out how we're going to get there. So having some real numbers and a target date, that's the type of momentum that we need. It's a measurable outcome, and becomes very objective. So we really want to start to think that through. And the way we're going to get there is to have a budget in place, looking at our income and expenses to try to figure out how we're going to reach that target date. So there's a lot of different methods in terms of budgeting, and how we get there. This is going to be dependent on some of your financial goals and how you structure your budget, your spending habits, which is what I talked about earlier in some of our behavioral models that we presented, getting those barriers out of the way. And then your personal preferences. We're going to have folks on the call that are really going to be into technology, and they want to do everything online or maybe on their phone or phone apps. And then we're going to have other folks that just don't want any part of that. They want to keep something simple, worksheet method, pen and paper, whatever it may be. To do this work, you got to find something that you want to, it's going to have to be unique to you. Okay. You have to find that method that's going to truly work for you. So long as you're reaching, so long as it's clear in terms of your overall approach, that is, worksheet method, budgeting app, it has to be consistent through time. We really want to stay the course once we decide to do this work. So a couple different budgets here, and I've presented these in the past, so I won't go into great detail, but these are the methods that I'm talking about. If you don't have a budget right now and you're just wanting to establish something, this is a simple framework to wrap things around the 50-30-20. This is going to look at your income and expenses, but the key here is that we do have a savings goal. Remember what I mentioned earlier about discretionary spending. Here, you meet your required expenses. You got 30% of discretionary funds. You can kind of do whatever you want with. In this case, what we're trying to do is to structure a budget, income minus expenses. What do we do with this? It's a big picture kind of budget, but it allows us at least to have some structure. So this would be folks who are new to budgeting, want to get things, kind of started towards building an emergency savings fund. Money flow budget. I really love this approach. This would be for folks who have consistently budgeted and kind of are ready to take the next step. This is an automated approach. There's a lot of tools through the credit union that can be built into this budget. I'll share those with you as we move towards setting up our fund. But this is where basically we set it and forget it. We know our upfront expenses. We know reoccurring expenses, and allows us to, we could easily through this budget set up a separate fund and have funds pulled automatically. It's all within our overall budget. So that is, we're planning for the emergency savings fund, and we can set things up to have automated transfers and some other tools used. But this is an automated approach that can be integrated right with your bank account, and will produce some outstanding results for you. This approach is spending by priority. Again, what it does here is it's a very simple way to do budgeting, but we meet our utilities. We automatically have a savings goal built into this budget as well. But in this case, this doesn't work on automation, but it's actually starts by savings or having a savings goal. And then the rest of our spending is just based on our own priorities. So it's a lot looser, but again, it structures the approach. And then our last is the most challenging, is what we call the zero sum. Income minus expenses equals zero, or every dollar has a destination. So this is where you really have to be, again, consistent income, not a lot of variation in your income. It's not based on seasonal or overtime, heavily, focused on overtime or weighted on overtime. You kind of, this one, and even with the overtime question, how predictable is that? So in this particular budget, it's really set up and intended for folks who have budgeted, I think, for a longer period of time and have minimized some of their outstanding debts and just now really ready to dive in and have everything moving towards some larger financial goal. So I present those budgets to you because you really cannot reach your emergency savings goals until you set a budget up. You know, so it requires you to do, ultimately what we're talking about is the emergency fund is always going to be the outcome of all these other steps having been met first. Okay, so when you think about, you know, the importance of budgeting, it's hard to create that savings goal if we don't actually have a budget in place. And I'll encourage you to go back and take a look at some of the other webinars that we've presented where we go into a lot of detail on budgeting. But I wanted to share it again with you today because it is one of the areas where I think sometimes folks will bypass it and just go straight to, hey, I want to set up an emergency savings fund. Well, the question is, have you done some of the other work yet? Because if you haven't, that's going to keep us from reaching any of our other outcomes. So let's assume for a moment that you have chosen a method, whether it's the automated approach or 50-30-20. I'm going to use this as an example where we've created a budget, we're ready to do the work. Now we're analyzing our overall spending patterns, okay? And this is where we're looking at some of the trade-offs. You know, we've met our required expenses, our fixed expenses. Now we're looking at discretionary spending. And there's a lot of stuff that can go into this. I mean, I've listed some of the common areas, you know, dining out, meal subscriptions, gym memberships, shopping. This could be for those perceived deals that we mentioned earlier, books, music, entertainment, travel expenses. I mean, we're moving into the summer travel. You know, a lot of us are already thinking about going places and doing things. All those things come with a cost. So once you've set up a budget, this is where you've got to go in and say, what can I give up to gain something else? And in this case, that something else is really, you know, our financial goal that we've set. I mean, the reason that we're on the call, we want to create an emergency savings fund. So to get there, we're going to have to give some of these things up. And that is not easy to do. So I'm going to challenge you to kind of go back through your own budget, take a look, you know, after the call, look at your discretionary expenses, particularly go into your bank account and start to look for patterns. You know, are you falling into an area where you're just spending way too much money dining out, or most of us, it's going to be, we will fall into these kind of patterns in our own spending. It will be unique to you and to your family, but all of us have some pattern. I certainly have within my own family have a consistent watch on our own patterns that kind of creep in, but go and look at the numbers. You know, what are you starting to see? What stands out to you? What kind of common pattern you're seeing in your discretionary spending? Because making those adjustments is how we build the fund. So the next piece that we're going to look at is tracking our expenses. So within our budget itself, again, we've looked at our income and our overall expenses. We've set up some budgeting method that we prefer. Okay, we've chosen one of those budgets that I've presented. And now we're going to take things, those items are really nice because it gives us hard numbers on, you know, our fixed expenses, some of our discretionary spending. But we're going to look at tracking our cash expenses because these are dollars that are not necessarily captured in our overall budget. You know, we've created this plan, but maybe we're not really tracking our expenses or cash expenses in the way that we should. Now, it's an incredibly important tool to use because, again, in addition to our budget, this tracks all those cash expenses that are not going to be represented in our overall numbers. This gives us some of that additional savings that we need to build emergency savings. So in a similar form, what are the patterns? Okay. Now, with tracking, what we're really looking at is, I would encourage you to do this at minimum for a month. And the truth is, a month is just really getting you started. If you're wanting to create a new financial behavior, you're going to have to do this for several months, and you're going to have to be heavily engaged in the process. And there's a lot of literature that makes that point. You know, the science there and financial decision making is pretty clear. If you're not doing it regularly, you're not tracking through time, that is, it's got to become a habit. You need to do this for several months. You're not going to do it very well. So as we talked about in budgeting, finding something that's unique, that works for you. Maybe you're a tech person, maybe you're online, spreadsheet method, whatever it may be, similar form exists here. You know, do you want to keep things simple? Do you want to go online? How do you do it? Find that method that works for you. And then we start to look at our overall expenses. What are you purchasing? Again, looking for patterns, okay? Is it entertainment, food, transportation? You know, you're running around with the kids. Where are you spending your money? That's what we're going to try to shift, you know, making a couple shifts, giving up something to gain something else. What can we do to minimize expenses? And then we have a lot of tools through the credit union to analyze our spending patterns. Go into your bank account. You know, if you're using your debit card, go into your bank account, look at your transaction history, and start to look for patterns. What emerges behind those numbers? What's the story? You know, and behind every, you know, you look into your transaction history, go back a month, go back several months, you should probably start to see a pattern. And it's really interesting to do that homework because you'll really learn a lot about your overall decision making. Now, I always like to put a plug in for the money management tool, so I'm going to do that again. But this is a great way, you know, through the credit union to just go back in and look at your overall spending. So, you know, you can set up, you know, there's a lot of ways to set this up through the credit union, but it can be integrated into your accounts. If you don't want to do all that, then I would say at least become aware of this tool and see if it would work for you. Okay, not only as a tracking tool, but to better help you with budgeting and your emergency savings fund. You can auto-generate certain budget items, so you can kind of tie that to that automated budget that I talked about. You could, let's say you are wanting to pay off maybe a loan that you have. You could, you know, make some additional payments, set it up to pull, you know, in addition to your monthly payment, you know, $50 to $75 extra a month to kind of accelerate loan repayment. All these things can be built in simply by using the money management tool. So if you're not aware of that through the credit union, once again, try to bring your attention to it. So now let's get into the highlight of our call today, which is really how we build our emergency savings fund. So this is kind of that final piece. We've looked at maybe some errors in our decision making, how to shift behavior, created a budget, we've tracked our expenses. Now we're actually building the fund. So, you know, most of us, I think, we're trying to build this cash fund for several reasons. One, we want to plan for those emergencies. They are going to come. We all have faced some type of risk. It's always around the corner. And we know without any type of savings that we wind up using credit cards or having to borrow. It's a financial shock. And most of us at this point, we really need some additional work to build that fund so we don't go further into debt. Okay. So get this question a lot. How much do I need in this emergency savings fund? Now, you're going to get a whole range of answers on this, from television personalities to financial articles, all sorts of things. I will answer it this way, okay? Now, when we look at our budget, we know that there are some fixed expenses that are very, very important that have to be met. So car loan, anything that's loan based or an obligation through our loans, okay? So if you looked at something like a mortgage, a car loan, some of your credit cards, you know, how do you prioritize? Well, certainly when we're looking at some of our obligations, those things that we're obligated to, not discretionary expenses and those other things, we really want to be able to protect, you know, those types of things. So you can always set a goal. Facing a hardship, what would I do? How far should I go? Folks tend to set this 3-month timeline because it's kind of assumed that if something happens, I can get a job in 3 months. If I get sick, I can turn myself around. I can be back on my feet, you know, within a reasonable time frame. So you're going to see this number pop up in a lot of literature. You know, at least have some emergency funds to cover 3 months. Well, that's pretty tough to do for a lot of families right now. They don't have $1,000 that they can pull from, or how do they even set this goal? So I'm going to say that for folks right now, this is why it's very, very important that we look at our overall budget and really get to the bottom line. What is it that, in facing a hardship, I would like to see, set some goal for yourself. If it's $1,000, if it's $3,000, whatever it is, we incrementally need to start setting an amount that we move towards. That is going to be key. If you don't, again, if it's not specific, then you're never going to reach it. So how much do you need? Well, how much can you afford? How much can we afford to put into this account? Ideally, yes, would love to see 3 months, but in practice, most of us don't carry 3 months in emergency savings. But let's build some type of modest plan so that if there is a $1,000 hardship, can you cover it? So I can't give you a specific number. It's going to be tied to your budget. It's going to be tied to your overall debts, how much money you spend in your discretionary spending. But what I'm going to say is whatever amount that you choose, you need to be very clear on that dollar amount. If it's consistently, you're going to put 25 a weekend, 50, 150, whatever it's going to be, the goal is to keep it consistent through time. So you don't want these peaks and valleys. You want it to be a fund that you're building through time. If you set a goal in 6 months, I want to be here at X amount, something you've defined through your budget. Let's say it's $1,000, $2,000. Then we need to be consistent in how much we put away. Okay. So that's why I've listed some of these amounts. Really, to do that, the budget has to be in place, consistently tracking and monitoring your expenses to make sure that you're staying within your budget, tracking your overall cash expenses, and then through the credit union, having a dedicated account where you're putting money into that savings, every week or every other week. There may be some that only get paid once a month. That's a budgeting challenge in itself. But whatever that dollar amount is, you need to have a consistent method for putting that away. Okay, keep the dollar amount the same and consistent towards your goal. So we'll look at now, how do we set up these contributions? What's the best way to do this? Okay, so there are a lot of ways to set up your contributions, and we'll talk about this in a minute in more detail. But if you have a budget set up through the GE Money Management tool, that can be set up for automatic transfers into a separate emergency savings fund. You can personally make those transfers, or payroll can make those transfers. And we'll get into those details, but there are a lot of ways to create that fund, but make it consistent. One of the things also that we haven't talked about is taking advantage of this one-time savings. Some of us may get bonuses. You may have something where you've worked, you've met a certain milestone, one-time kind of thing that happens. Those things we want to create some savings. We put a portion of that into our overall savings. Use that to build our overall savings fund. Tax time is here. Many of us may have already used our taxes. If you haven't, you want to take advantage of that as well. But anytime you come in within the year to an additional amount of money that's really kind of outside of your budget, you work some overtime pay, something else has happened, take a portion of that and put it into that emergency savings fund. Build that cash fund. Now, first strategy that I want to present to you in building this fund is to make it automatic. That's why I brought in the GE Money Management tool, because it can be used in that form. Having a budget set up to automatically pull money into the account is a great way to do it. Let's just kind of walk our way through this for a moment. So, in setting up a dedicated account for emergency savings, the automation really has shown tremendous results. If you look at financial literature on this topic, automation, it really works. The outcomes are very strong, and it's a way to kind of set it and forget it. You start to build that account. Again, set your budget up, know what your bottom line is, track your expenses and be engaged. But now let's figure out how much do we want to start to put towards that larger goal. Let's just say it's $1,000, okay? So now we're going to start creating this automatic approach. You can set it up to where it's pulled automatically through the credit union and transferred into your account, okay? Or you could do this through your payroll contributions. You could have payroll, you know, your payroll from your employer can set it up and have a significant, I'm sorry, you can set it up to have money deposited into your account so that within 6 months, you've got a significant savings there. Again, it's all about automation. You can do it on your own, a tool can do it, an employer can do it. Just make sure that you're doing it, okay? This is the most common way we've seen for 401ks, whether we've seen emergency savings across the board, automation. The better we can automate the process, the better the outcome. Now, I've given you some variations on the emergency savings kind of theme, places where automation has really shown some significant gains. You know, 401k is a great example of this, but let's say you want to increase that for emergency savings down the road where you had to borrow in case of some type of hardship. Again, some modest contribution that you've done, 401k, IRA, whatever it may be, that automated approach really starts to build that fund. Again, automation makes certain that you're always paying yourself first. It's tied into those budgets that I talked about earlier. That savings goal is always there. You put money into the account. Having money automatically pulled, it also makes it a predictable monthly expense so that you know every month in your budget, X amount is going into your account. And then we've also talked, you know, again, about just making those transfers. So lots of ways to do this, okay? Despite inflation, despite all those other things, there's tools to get the job done. Now, the last thing that I wanted to share with you was where we can actually use some of the credit union tools to help us along the way. So we're going to assume that we've already got something set up through the credit union as a separate emergency savings fund. We're using our budget, we're transferring funds over, doing automatic transfers. So that money is already being transferred into this account, it's building it through time. Another approach that you may not be aware of is where we can use what's called the Roundup program or Roundup approach, where we basically use our debit card to round up every transaction to the nearest dollar amount. Those funds would get rolled into an emergency savings fund. So, you know, think about all the times where you're using your debit card, those increments can really add up over a year's time. So you make a weekly transfer or every other week, you're putting money in automatically into the fund. Any windfall is going into that fund. Maybe you also have payroll, make a small change in your payroll so that you have this third bucket of funds coming in, and now you're automating the process through Roundup. You know, within 6 months or a year, we've really done a lot, you know. The Roundup approach can also, and you will have to talk with the credit union on this because I'm not exactly sure what the dollar amounts are, but you can also round up to the nearest dollar, or you could round up, you know, even more, a couple of dollars. So it just depends on how far you would want to go into this process. But you want to be reasonable about it because you don't want to, you know, overextend yourself where you start to max your account out at some point. But the Roundup program is very, very interesting. I think that's a great way to incrementally put in, you know, it could be $300, maybe $500 just in Roundup over a year's time just by using your debit card. So, and these are increments of the nearest dollar that can make a, you know, a tremendous impact in addition to all the other work that you're doing. So just reach out and speak with folks at the credit union. And if you're interested in doing that, we'll get set up to round those expenses up and build your emergency savings. So that really is where we're at in terms of our conclusion. For today, what I wanted us to do was to be aware again, of some of the psychological impact in our own decision making and what that means, setting up a budget and being clear on our income and expenses, tracking through time, and then using automation and some of the tools through the credit union to really build that fund. And the roundup approach being one of the new ones that we presented today. So with that, I'll take some of your questions, and hopefully today's webinar has given you a lot of information and gets the wheels turning and getting you thinking about how to set your fund up. So I'll take those questions now, Kelly.
Yes, thank you, Todd. For anyone on the webinar, if you have a question, you can go ahead and submit that using your questions feature, and we will get to as many as we can in the time we have, or go until we have no more with our allotted time. The first question is, how do I determine what I can use my emergency savings fund for?
Yeah, well, I would say that's going to be entirely up to you. But, when we set up an emergency savings, the purpose again is that we want to avoid accumulating some other type of debt, credit card debt, having to purchase a loan, something else. So that's where I would say, again, setting up that fund and thinking about you need to define that early on. Is this to cover just some type of hardship, or how, set it up that's very specific. Like when I think about doing this work, I would say, if we set a goal for a couple $1,000s in emergency savings, this can be used, again, your car breaks down, you have an emergency at the house, the water heater goes out, your gutter falls off from a large rainstorm. There's all sorts of things can happen. Any of those are valid. We've got the funds to cover that, so we don't have to go out and finance in some way to pay for that hardship. Kids need something, someone steals the laptop. I mean, it's all over the map. The real point is that you've been putting money towards this fund and, just assuming that something is going to happen. Okay, there's always that risk. It's around the corner, and we all face a hardship at some point. So what you don't want to do is, I guess I can answer this almost in the negative. What you don't want to do is tap into the emergency savings fund just as a form of your discretionary spending. Then all the other work that we've talked about today is really, it really is ineffective, because what our goal is to keep funds there for paying off, let's say that you build this emergency fund, that's to pay off some type of hardship where we don't want to get into further debt, but you don't want to use it as discretionary spending. So lots of variation on what you can, in terms of the important things, make sure it's tied to things that, your home, your kids, other things like that, work-related things, not just overall spending to burn through the cash. I hope that helps.
Our next question says, what are the key factors to consider when determining the appropriate size of my emergency savings fund?
Yeah, the key factors, again, would be looking at, I would say, again, go back to what we talked about in terms of our overall budget. If something were to happen, how much would it cost for you to, manage going into, you don't want to go into default for some of your other credit obligations, your home, your car, some of your credit card debts, etc. There's a lot that we can shift in terms of discretionary spending, but just those three expenses alone could be, that's a significant amount of money. So if we're thinking about what factors to really look at, meeting our credit obligations and making sure that we don't go into default in some way over a 90-day period of time, having some hardship, that's going to be the goal. So again, this is all going to be dependent on your own personal finances, but this is where you've got to really sit down, work out that budget, figure out what the bottom line is. Most of us oftentimes want to create this emergency savings goal, and we've not even shifted our own discretionary spending. There's really not that much to pull from. So we could do a lot of work paying off debts and some other things before we ever even really build the fund, but as I've mentioned in the presentation today, this is where automation comes in and why it's so important. through those small increments, we can build that fund and, continue to meet all of our other obligations through budgeting. So yeah, I hope that helps.
This next question says, what are some common unexpected expenses that I should be accounting for in my emergency fund?
Yeah, I feel like I'm repeating myself on this. I mean, again, what we're looking for, those common expenses are going to be, I would say, focus on the most important part, the credit obligations and our fixed expenses. And if you could do that through your fund, I think that you'll have reached your goal. Again, that's why folks focus on this kind of like 3-month period of time, because they would say, 90 to 120 days is when we really get ourselves into significant hardship, charge off on accounts and things like that, where we can really have long-term credit consequences. So I approach it from that angle. And if you're looking, again, home loans, car loans, any credit obligation, that's going to be top priority as I look at how much I would need in that fund.
This next question's in regards to utilizing an emergency fund. It says, what steps can I take to rebuild my emergency fund after withdrawing from it in an emergency?
Yeah, well, this is where we're just going to have to go back and repeat that process. Let's say that you build it up to $2,000. Something happened where, again, something at the home, or there was a plumbing issue or something else, and you had to use your emergency savings to really meet that obligation. This is where we go back and we have to go through this entire process again. The nice thing about setting things up early on with automation, I know I've talked a lot about this today, but the nice thing about that is, even despite maybe maxing that out, let's assume it's $2,000, you're still, because it's part of the overall budgeting process and because you've automated it, where either you're transferring it into the fund or it's set up through payroll, those things, now you're going to rebuild that fund through time. So you've maxed out the fund, you've had a hardship, you paid the plumbers and things are working fine again at the home. Now you're going to rebuild. Keep things consistent. That's consistency. That's what I've tried to emphasize today on the call, is once you've set that amount, now it's just kind of part of your personal finances now. Every other paycheck or every week, we know X amount is going into the fund. So despite maxing it out at $2,000, within 3 months, I've already started to rebuild the fund. So it's just an ongoing process. And that's what you want this to be. You want this to be a consistent, ongoing process. So as that fund is built and you've depleted some or a portion of that account, through automation, we're always looking, it's always going to be available for that next risk or that next problem to come. So keep things consistent and stay within that process of automation.
This next question says, should I prioritize paying off debt or building my emergency savings fund first?
Well, this goes to our mental accounting question that I presented earlier. See, this is where we have that subjective criteria. I would encourage you to go back and look at that that part of the presentation with mental accounting. Think about that concept, because here the question is, again, I want this larger emergency savings goal, but I have significant debt. Well, if I've got significant debt, can I really adequately build the fund? If you look at your budget, your income, your expenses, how much is going towards my overall credit obligations, there may not be that much that's left. So in this particular case, I would say that we would try to pay off, a larger portion of our outstanding debt, free up our debts. Debt universally keeps us from reaching our overall financial goals, emergency savings, 401k, you name it. So that's that mental accounting error that we make. In this case, what I would suggest is, again, we focus. You could have something modest going into the account, but we're never really going to build the account appropriately until we get out of debt. So debt, it would be the first priority.
And then this looks like our last question. It says, should I be utilizing the money directly from my accounts to cover emergency expenses, or is it best to put the charges on a credit card?
Well, that is the fundamental purpose of our emergency savings, is to keep us from having to use credit cards or other, to go further into debt through loans or some other form. So we always want, that's the purpose of building that emergency savings, is that we have those funds available. That's why we plan for a hardship or risk to come. So we would start by utilizing, and let's be practical. There could be instances where we utilize a certain portion of emergency savings, and it could be a significant expense where we have to use both. We have to do both emergency savings and a credit card. But the ultimate goal for our conversation today is that if we're going through a process to build our emergency savings fund, we always want to build that fund through time, so that if there is a hardship, we don't have to go further in debt. We can just utilize the funds that we have available and then rebuild that through our process that we've talked about today, so that we're not going to be stuck with a repair at a high interest rate on a credit card. We can just tap into the emergency savings fund. We've met our obligation and we move forward. So we don't pay through time through a more expensive form, financing on a credit card or something like that. So the emergency fund is there to offset any future expenses. That's what's going to save us from all those additional dollars in interest. So utilize the emergency savings first. That's number one priority.
All right, a lot of great questions and great content. Thank you, Todd, so much for answering questions and taking us through today's presentation. But with that, that is going to conclude today's webinar. Thank you all so much for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.